The Flea. Tsura. Tsura hadn't needed more than a few hours of rest. On Saturday afternoon, she left Marko asleep in the wine cellar and walked to Seraph's apartment in the Bavarian quarter. With the city swarming with Gestapo, Wolf and Seraph were nowhere to be found. In hiding, most likely. At the apartment, Tsura had washed and changed her clothes before returning to the wine cellar. When she'd kicked Marko awake, he'd groaned and told her to leave him alone. She returned to the apartment. Kizzy had been caught. The hospital staff had confirmed it, and Tsura felt paralyzed. Wolf would know what to do. She fell asleep on the sofa, waiting for him and Seraph to return. On Sunday morning, with still no sign of them, Tsura made herself a sandwich with cheese and stale bread and set out for the train station. Usually, avoiding the checkpoints wasn't too difficult, but sometimes it was impossible. Close to the U-Bahn station, Tsura became Greta. As the soldiers inspected her papers, Tsura's thoughts were stuck on Kizzy, leading her to picture Marzan, her mother, and baby Samuel, his lifeless body in Aunt Marie's arms. The soldiers had watched from afar as Tsura's family buried the boy. How could anyone hate a child? She forced a smile at the station guards, and they sent Greta Veska on her way. Underground, waiting on the platform with a few dozen others, Tsura heard the approaching rattling of a train. She disliked traveling on the city train lines, mostly because diligent police guards paid close attention to the commuters. But Tsura's false identity documents gave her access to the U-Bahn system, which cut her journey time across the city and kept her out of the cold. Tsura jumped when a woman's scream echoed against the walls. It was followed by panicked shouts. "Help her!" Someone had fallen onto the tracks. When she heard a baby's cry, Tsura pushed her way through the group of onlookers. "Move!" Tsura shouted. On the tracks, a woman was on her back, eyes wide, stunned by the fall, a crying baby in her arms. "The train is coming!" someone screamed. Tsura blocked out the panicked shouts of the frantic crowd and jumped down from the platform's edge. "Give me the baby!" Tsura ordered. The clattering of the train grew louder. For a moment, the woman was motionless. "Now!" The woman raised the baby into the air. Tsura grabbed the swaddled infant. "Here!" Tsura tossed the child toward the shocked witnesses. Two women caught the baby as Tsura spun around to reach for the woman's arms. "Help me!" the mother screamed. "The train!" a man shouted. Tsura hauled the woman to her feet, and with her shoulder beneath the woman... Tsura hauled the woman to her feet, and with her shoulder beneath the mother's thigh, pushed her up and onto the platform. The people on the platform yelled, "Hurry! The train! Dear God!" Tsura dragged herself onto the platform just before the train rattled by. The crowd surged forward. "You saved her! Are you all right? God bless you!" The train screeched to a halt. The baby, in its mother's arms again, continued to wail. Hands on Tsura's back pushed her toward the woman and child she rescued. The woman was sitting on the platform, cradling her infant. With tears in her eyes, the mother looked up at Tsura. "Thank you. You'll be rewarded for what you did. My husband is a senior government official. You saved his son." The woman smiled warmly, waiting for Tsura's response. Tsura had nothing to say. The woman continued, "Tell me, what's your name?" Tsura's feelings of pride and relief for the woman and the child's safety had transformed into a penetrating hatred that forced Tsura to clench her fists, to control herself. "I have to leave." She turned away. Strangers in the crowd called out, "Wait!" as she boarded the crowded U-Bahn train. Standing shoulder to shoulder with other commuters, Tsura held on as the train sputtered to life and pulled away from the station. If I'd known she was a Nazi, Tsura cut her thoughts short. She exited the train and arrived at the professor's house. She checked for signs of Kizzy. Nothing. Tiredness was setting in, but Tsura couldn't stay there in that cold house filled with memories. Avoiding the train, she'd walked for an hour or so to Motstrasa. "Where have you been?" Marko asked as Tsura climbed down into the wine cellar. Tsura sat on the mattress beside him. "We need to get to Marzan." The cries of the baby on the tracks repeated in Tsura's head. I should have let the infant die. Her hand on her lower stomach, she wanted to scream out. When Tsura was 11 years old, 1 year before the encampment at Marzan was opened, Nazi doctors ordered her mother to bring Tsura to a clinic in the city. Tsura was sterilized on the spot, along with 3 Sinti girls. She would never bear children, never know the feeling of her breasts swelling at the sound of her baby's cry. While Tsura had cried in pain, Mother had cried for the children Tsura would never have. Alexander. Balanced on the windowsill, Alex put his head against the glass and looked down to the street below. In the early morning light, a dozen or so women stood in front of the community center. Alex almost shouted out when he saw his mother standing among them. He tapped on the glass. The women looked up, and Mother waved and blew him kisses with her gloved hand. Was Mama out there all night? "Papa, quickly, guess who's here," he said, gesturing for his father to join him on the ledge. Father climbed up. "Annette!" he shouted through the glass. He turned to Alex. "She shouldn't be out there. She'll get herself arrested." Alex's mother beamed and waved with delight. She was shouting something, but they couldn't hear her words. Father climbed down while Alex kept watch at the window, his eyes fixed on his mother. As the sunrise beckoned another day, small groups of people walked onto Rosenstrasse from the side streets. The crowd was growing again. "They're coming back," Alex announced to the room. The men perked up. "They are? How many? Can you see my wife?" Hope swelled in Alex's chest. He looked out from Marko's face, wondering if he'd heard about the demonstration. The protest was heartening. Such a collective outcry against Hitler's regime was unheard of. Yesterday, when a Nazi police guard had walked into the room and ordered Father to hand over his house keys because his wife had been locked out, Alex had almost laughed aloud. Immediately, Alex had entwined his broken gold chain and cross around the key ring to signify to Mother that he was in the building too. "Roll call," Simon the orderly shouted from the doorway. "Alexander, get down from there," his father said with panic in his voice. Alex, along with the other men who had been standing at the windows, jumped to the floor. Roll call was tedious and nerve-wracking. Breakfast would not be served until all prisoners had been accounted for. Alex stood between Father and Mr. Fetterman as the Nazi officers counted them and checked them off their lists. Then they began to count again. Mr. Lessel was jumping from foot to foot. "God, I'm bursting," he whispered. Alex laughed, and Mr. Lessel scowled, then smiled back. "Breakfast is ready," Simon announced once the counting was complete. Mr. Lessel ran ahead toward the toilet. Led downstairs, Alex and Mr. Fetterman looked out for Leah. "Papa!" she yelled as the men passed the doorway to one of the women's rooms. "Leah, are you all right?" Mr. Fetterman shouted back. "I'm fine," she called out and locked eyes with Alex. Leah blushed and Alex gave her an awkward smile. Downstairs, Alex stood in line with the other men. "Sauerkraut and potatoes today," the men at the front announced. "Thank God," Father said. "You can say that again," Mr. Lessel said, joining them in line. Yesterday's lunch and dinner had been cabbage. A collective fear that supplies would run out had spread through the building. But the men were kind enough to allow those who hadn't eaten during the last meal stand at the front of the line. Returning to their room on the upper floor, some of the men laughed as they listened through the floor to an argument amongst the women downstairs. But the quarrel settled down quickly and was replaced by pleasant singing. Alex was bored as everyone else was. Some men had been telling stories. One man had created a chessboard out of a piece of mattress. Mr. Lessel had spent his time writing in what Alex suspected was his diary. Another man, nicknamed a know-it-all by some of the men, talked incessantly about history and politics, which Alex found interesting. Last night, the Gestapo had brought more Jews to the building, always Jews with non-Jewish families, which was a great sign, Father had said. The rooms were overcrowded now. 3 men, including Mr. Lessel, climbed up onto the sill and began providing commentary on what they could see. "There are at least 100 people out there." The room filled with optimistic chatter. "Most are women, and there are a few men and children." Cathedral bells sounded in the distance. "They're missing Sunday morning services to be here," Mr. Lessel said. Another hour passed. Again, it was Alex's turn to stand at the window. The sight of the crowded street amazed him. Through the glass, Alex could hear the muffled sounds of shouting from below. "I think the guards are telling the crowd to leave," Alex said to the men. An uneasy whisper spread across the room. Father stood up. "What are the women doing?" Alex watched for the crowd's reaction. "Nothing. They're staying put." "Is your mother still out there?" Father asked. When Alex saw Ruthie's friend Elise in the crowd, standing close to his mother, his eyes searched for Ruthie, but she wasn't there. Ruth. Ruth pushed through the crowd. The protesters were waving frantically at the windows. Even though they couldn't hear one another, they still shouted the names of their loved ones. And then, like yesterday, all the faces disappeared. "Mama," Ruth called out. "Did you see them? Did you see Papa? Did you see Alexander?" "We saw Alex," Elise told her. "Where?" Ruth shouted. "The same window," Mama said, and pointed to the left of the building. 3 windows up. But the window was empty now. This morning, when Ruth and Elise had arrived on Rosenstrasse, Mama had told them how she'd stayed awake all night and seen Alexander and Papa at the window, just after sunrise. Ruth was about to cry. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes with her fingers and scrunched up her face to stop the tears. I can't believe I wasn't here." She'd chosen the wrong time to find a toilet. She'd been waiting in line inside the cafe up the street and missed the commotion. Ruth kept her eyes on the windows in the hope Alexander would make another appearance. Her thoughts led Ruth to Alexander's treasure hunt. "I need to find the woman's place of birth." "Elise, where were you born?" "What? Were you born here in Berlin? And what about your mother?" "Berlin, both of us. Why?" Ruth folded her arms and tapped her foot. There was a second unsolved riddle, too. "Rose petals, white piping, a reverse pickpocket," she said out loud. It was lunchtime now, and the protest was strengthening. Some people had walked from Bahnhofbourse train station. The protesters were coming from all over the city. More women had approached the Nazi guards to ask for their keys. Most of the time, the guards returned with proof the women's Jewish husbands were inside. The crowd continued to grow. The church services were over, and some of the women had brought along their friends and neighbors. "Go home," one of the guards shouted. "We're not going anywhere," Mama whispered to Ruth. They joined the crowd in a communal silent stare. "Go home or we'll shoot," another soldier yelled. Still nobody moved. What was exciting to Ruth, but also frightening, was the sight of the soldiers on edge. "It'll take more than threats to get us to leave," Mama said. "It's Sunday. We have nowhere else to be." Without warning, the crowd was forced to stand back as trucks pulled up to the front of the community center. "Look," Ruth said. Soldiers dragged Jewish people. Yellow stars adorned their coats and shirts and dresses into the building. That Jews were being brought here was no longer a secret. One Jewish man turned and waved at a young woman in the crowd. She waved and called at him until a Nazi soldier kicked the Jew hard, and he disappeared into the building. The protesters gasped. This must be the building's only entrance. Otherwise, they'd be taking them through another door, Ruth said. "You know what, Ruthie? You're right." Mama clapped her hands at her daughter's shrewd thinking. Ruth beamed. More tea was passed around. More protesters joined the crowd, watching the windows, waiting. In the middle of the afternoon, some of the protesters began to chuckle. A woman had approached the Nazi guards with a cake, asking them if she could take it inside. The guards sent her away. "It's Monday tomorrow," Mama said. As the evening neared on the second day of the protest, Mama approached some of the other women. She returned with an account of their decision. "We'll be missing work tomorrow and coming here instead." Pride surged through Ruth's chest. They were refusing to give up. "Will you stay out here again tonight?" Ruth asked. "Not tonight, my darling. I'm exhausted. But some of the other women have volunteered. We're taking turns." Mama turned to Elise. "We'll take you home. We can pick you up in the morning if you like." "I have school tomorrow," Elise said. Ruth laughed and poked her friend in the arm. "Don't be silly. We get to miss it." They began their trek toward Elise's home. A ball of sadness sat in Ruth's throat. "Did Alexander look all right?" "He looked well," Mama added. She squeezed Ruth's hand. "I'm sure he was looking for you. I can't believe I didn't see him." Elise. Victor's voice woke her. It was still dark outside. Today, Monday, was the day of the Luftwaffe. Last week in Girls' League, Elise had learned about the celebration. Hitler's head of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, had declared the first day of March a national thank you to the fighter planes and their extraordinary power. Even though he hadn't flown planes, it made Elise think about Father, fighting on the front, risking his life for his people. Elise washed and dressed. In the kitchen, another dirty cup sat beside hers. Mother had woken in the middle of the night. As the morning light appeared across the kitchen, Elise took a bite of hardened bread, but she wasn't all that hungry. She swept the floor and wiped some countertops. Someone knocking on the front door made Elise's mother jump. "Who's that?" "Ruth and Frau Broden." "On a Monday morning?" Until now, Elise had avoided talking to Mother about the demonstration on Rosenstrasse. Ruth's brother and father were arrested. They're being held in the city. I'm going with them. Ruth and Mrs. Broden knocked again. Mother held her dressing gown closed. "Don't let them inside." With a heavy sigh, Elise walked into the hallway and opened the door. "Good morning, Elise." Ruth was chirpy. Mrs. Broden winked. "It's a perfect day for a protest, don't you think?" Elise forced herself to respond. "Good morning. Good morning, Frau Broden. Did you eat?" "We had a big breakfast," Mrs. Broden said. "More birthday leftovers," Ruth added. A feeling of impatience and resentment swelled in Elise's stomach. Since Alex had been arrested, Ruth hadn't been acting like a friend. Ruth still hadn't apologized for insulting Elise's family, and when Ruth had missed seeing Alexander at the window, rather than show gratitude that her father and brother hadn't yet been sent to a Nazi camp, as they should have been, Ruth had complained. "Is your mother joining us?" Mrs. Broden asked. "She's not feeling well," Elise fibbed. What must Frau Broden be thinking? Mother and Mrs. Broden were once friends. They'd cooked together and gossiped over tea in their kitchens. They met at church when the girls were young. But after Victor died, everything changed. Elise put on her thick sweater, heavy overcoat, hat and gloves. She wouldn't only be missing school, she'd be missing the Girls' League meeting as well. Elise left her Girls' League jacket and beret hanging on the hook in the hallway. Mrs. Broden had brought them a bag of food, and Elise ate a little cheese on the way back to Rosenstrasse. Elise sighed when Ruth babbled away again about her awful treasure hunt. They went west. In his white hospital gown, Victor dragged his feet beside them. Hundreds of people stood on Rosenstrasse, shoulder to shoulder, facing the Jewish Community Center and the Nazi guards. Today was the third day of the demonstration, and the government had closed Bahnhof Borsa train station to make it difficult for people to congregate. Someone important is paying attention, Mrs. Broden said. There was still a line of police guards, at least 20 of them now in their metal helmets, holding their guns. Elise rolled her eyes as the women yet again hoped out loud that their husbands and children would be released. The soldiers are so frightening, Ruth said. To Elise, the guards looked anxious and just as scared. She recognized the soldier she'd seen on Saturday, the young man who looked like Victor, with pale skin and blue eyes, his fair hair flickering in the wind. Part of Elise wished she were wearing her Girls' League uniform. That would make him look at me, make him notice. Caught in her thoughts, Elise saw Victor standing next to the guard, a metal soldier's helmet in his hands. He hadn't died after all. Victor would have been 12 years old by now. By mid-afternoon, the street was so full that Elise couldn't count the individual protesters. The crowd stared at the quiet building, whispering amongst themselves, some drinking tea, a few smoking cigarettes. When the crowd became excited, Elise looked up to see faces at the windows again. Hands waved and tapped on the glass. People in the crowd called up, waving back, recognizing their relatives. Elise saw the same face once more, the same girl she'd seen on that first day of the protest, one level up, age 12 or 13, messy hair, brown coat, and blue-gray hat. Then she disappeared. Ruth stood on tiptoes. She looked at Elise. I hope I see Alexander. I can't believe you saw him. I'm jealous. Ruth was becoming more and more annoying. If Ruth had seen Victor at the window and I hadn't, I wouldn't be complaining. But I think I figured out another riddle, Ruth continued. I have to find someone's place of birth, a woman or a girl. On Saturday at Ruth's home, when Elise had told Ruth about Alex's girlfriend, Ruth had been too engrossed in her silly treasure hunt to listen. Elise wanted to repeat the gossip, but her irritation with Ruth kept her silent. On the other hand, Ruth would want to know, Elise knew. Elise nudged Ruth on the arm. I have to tell you something. Overhearing Elise's words, Mrs. Broden looked at the girls with a curious stare. Elise took Ruth's elbow and pulled her aside away from the adults. What's going on? Ruth asked, looking down at Elise's grip. Remember when I told you I saw Alex behind my house? Ruth nodded, listening. I think your brother has a girlfriend. Ruth didn't smile as Elise had expected. Why do you think that? I saw him, Elise said quietly, not wanting Mrs. Broden to hear. He was kissing some girl. What girl? Ruth said, her eyes bulging now. When? She doesn't know. Elise was glad she knew something Ruth didn't. On Friday night. I don't know who she was, but I saw them. From the window, they were definitely kissing. What time? Ruth asked, a smile creeping across her face. Elise shook her head. Why? Was it around midnight? Maybe. I don't know. Yes? Ruth said nothing, as if she knew more than she was letting on. She knows about Alex. Why would Ruth keep that a secret? Maybe she's here, Ruth said, standing on tiptoes again, looking across the crowd. Do you think she knows my brother was arrested? Do you think the girl I have to find for my treasure hunt could be Alexander's girlfriend? Maybe I need to find her. No, that doesn't make sense. Alexander didn't tell me about her. But she must be so worried. Elise, what did she look like? So, Ruth has never met her, Elise realized. I only saw the back of her head, and she was wearing a hat. Elise hadn't seen her face. Mrs. Broden couldn't hear their words, but she was paying attention to their gestures. What are you girls up to? Nothing, Ruth said. The protesters were still talking about seeing their family members in the window. I think you're right, Ruth whispered to Elise. What? Alexander was meeting a girl on Friday at midnight. I overheard him. She was keeping things from me. Elise felt irritated by Ruth all over again. We used to tell each other everything. A joke spread across the crowd. If only we had a wooden horse like the one sent by the Greeks, one of the women repeated. Mrs. Broden laughed. Let's send the Gestapo a gift. We'll sneak inside the building and rescue our families. Elise and Victor listened to their fantasy. Did you try to rescue me? Victor asked. If only I'd had a Trojan horse. Elise wanted to tell her brother. I would have climbed inside it myself. Victor would have believed the horse was real. His sickness made him think like that. He saw the world in a different way than other children his age. The Nazis saw him as untreatable, a mistake of nature, Elise's mother had called him. Until now, the crowd had been largely silent, just whispering and praising each other for missing work, for choosing to come to the center instead. The Gestapo has to listen. We're not asking for much, one woman said. We just want our husbands back. Another woman repeated her phrase. We want our husbands back. We want our husbands back, Mrs. Broden joined in. The words spread quickly through the crowd. The chant surged along the street. We want our husbands back, Ruth shouted along. Elise listened as the women and even the children and a few men shouted those same words. The Nazi guards looked at one another, not knowing how to respond. Elise watched the fair-haired soldier walk into the building, most likely to ask his superiors what they should do. The women continued to scream their words, as if it would make any difference. Look, Ruth said to Elise. She pointed to a man on the street standing amongst the women, a German soldier, around the age of Elise's father, shouting the same words as everyone else. Elise listened to the commentary around her. The protest resembled the women's suffrage demonstrations years earlier, one woman suggested, before women could vote and before they'd even heard of Adolf Hitler. Another woman talked about an Indian activist who would have been proud of them. Ruth appeared to be listening carefully, as if taking notes in her head, as if the lessons from history would make any difference today. The truth, Elise knew, was that history only repeated itself, and there was nothing anyone could do. As the crowd chanted, one woman nudged Elise to join in, but Elise kept her mouth closed. Elise didn't know why she couldn't bring herself to shout along, and she caught herself looking out for other members of the Girls' League. She was embarrassed to be there. I'm a hypocrite. The day went on. The evening would come soon. Again, the women made plans for some to stay overnight and to congregate the next morning. Let's go, Mrs. Broden said, and took Ruth's hand. We'll come back tomorrow. We'll need our energy if this protest drags on. Ruth and her mother walked Elise home. Mrs. Broden looked exhausted. I'll cook if you like, Elise said as they reached her street. No, thank you, my dear, Mrs. Broden said. Ruth gave Elise a half smile. Things between them felt different, but it was Ruth who was acting like a self-centered child. Elise knew how to be an adult. In her open doorway, Elise was about to say goodnight and close the door when Ruth jumped forward. Your coat! Elise, it's your coat! Ruth ran into the house. She grabbed Elise's thin pink coat from the rack. The white piping! And the color! Ruth checked every pocket. She huffed and stamped her feet. Mrs. Broden walked inside, closing the door behind her. Ruthie, what is it? She asked. A pickpocket in reverse, Ruth said, looking at her mother. Then she turned to Elise. When my brother gave you the other clue, the one labeled Freund, were you wearing this pink coat? Yes. Ruth grinned. He must have planted a second clue on you without you knowing. I know I'm right. A pickpocket in reverse. I figured it out. She always thinks she's right. Ruth checked the pockets of Elise's pink coat again and again. She checked the hallway floor and behind the other hanging coats. She couldn't find anything. Defeated, her eyes became glassy, but she didn't cry. Mrs. Broden sat herself on the stairs. Actually, Elise, some dinner sounds good right now. The sun was setting. Elise closed the small blackout curtain in the hallway and turned on the lamp. Mother was sitting in the living room wearing an apron. It was clear, however, that her mother hadn't been cleaning, and Elise couldn't smell food cooking. Mrs. Broden started a conversation with her while Elise and Ruth headed into the kitchen. There were crumbs on the floor and milk, now warm and stinking, spilled across the countertop. Heat up some water, Elise said to Ruth, pointing to a pot. With the chopping board and knife, Elise cut up potatoes and other root vegetables that were starting to mold. Ruth wiped down the table and Elise washed some bowls. When the stew was ready, they called their mothers into the kitchen. At the table, Mrs. Broden talked about the protest. The government is listening. We'll return to Rosenstrasse every day until every prisoner is released. I have a headache, Elise's mother said in response and climbed the stairs to bed. A rush of shame swelled in Elise's throat. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for, Mrs. Broden said sincerely. Are you okay, Elise? I'm fine. Nothing had been okay for a long time. Thanks for dinner, Ruth said, filling the awkward moment. Ruth and her mother put on their coats. See you in the morning, Elise said, forcing a smile. Elise closed the front door. Having Ruth as a friend was draining. As she washed the pot and bowls, she heard her mother heading back downstairs. Elise left the sink and followed Mother into the dark living room. After checking that the blackout curtains were closed, Elise turned on a lamp. Turn it off, Mother said. Elise had an urge to shout. Mother didn't need to behave like this. You really should see what's happening in the city, Elise said. "What's the time?" Mother asked. Elise checked the clock in the hall. "Almost 8:30. You should see the protests, the crowds, hundreds of people shouting for their husbands. It's astonishing." "Are their husbands all Jewish?" Mother asked. "Yes, they—" "Why should I bother standing out in the dead of winter, protesting on behalf of Jews?" Mother sounded like the leaders of the Girls' League, with their smug, parroted views about Jews and Poles. They squawked on about preparing for early motherhood in service of their fatherland and beloved Führer. "Why are you wasting your time on strangers, Elise? You should be helping me at home. What would your father say?" Elise argued back. "They're Broden and Alexander. They're in there too." Mother closed her eyes. Jews are Jews. She rested her hand against the high-backed armchair. Elise returned to the kitchen. She took a seat at the table, the dirty chopping board and knife in front of her. In his hospital gown, holding his metal helmet, Victor swung his legs from the chair. His hair was wet. His skin was a kind of gray. "What's wrong with her?" Elise asked him. Victor looked at the knife. Elise rolled up her sleeve. The scratches on her arm had faded. She touched them. Scars. Raised. Rough. Victor picked up the knife from the table, its handle heavy, its blade sharp, holding it out to his sister. "Not too deep," Victor said. Before Elise could put the blade to her skin, a long and terrifying bellowing sound jolted her to open her eyes. Oh, God. She dropped the knife. "Mama!" she screamed. Mother ran in from the living room. The air raid siren wailed and cried in waves, echoing through the house. Mother and Elise ran to the back door. Mother stopped in the doorway. "I need my coat," she said. "Mama, no!" Elise shouted. She took Mother by the hand, dragging her into their back garden and through a gap in the hedgerow. They'd done this before. Last year, because their basement was deeper, larger, and reinforced with more brick, their neighbors had offered them and their other neighbors to join them if ever the sirens went off. Elise opened the back door of their neighbor's home. They shuffled through their neighbor's kitchen, into the dark hallway and down into the basement. Their neighbors were already there. More people rushed down the stairs, including the rude woman from next door, Mrs. Unruh, and her children. Elise's mother screamed at the first sound of whistling. Then they heard a terrible crash, an explosion, close by. Everyone in the basement whimpered. There were a dozen of them in here at least. Mrs. Unruh's boys were making a racket, fighting each other to sit next to their mother, who was holding her sleeping baby. When they heard the zooming of planes overhead, some people started to cry. Ruth. Elise pictured Ruth and Mrs. Broden running through the burning streets. More explosions. More whistling. The ground and walls shook. Mrs. Unruh's baby was awake and wailing now. Mother held on to Elise. It was the first time they'd hugged in a long time. Elise buried her head in her mother's lap and covered her ears. She could feel Mother's hand patting on her back. The patting grew quicker, harder. Mother was trying to get her attention. Elise lifted her head. "Elise." "Ruth," Elise squealed. Elise's best friend was standing, looking over her with Mrs. Broden by her side. The girls held each other tight. "They're bombing Berlin," Ruth yelled over the noise. Elise let out a laugh, as if I couldn't guess. Marko. When he heard the siren, Marko cheered. From the wine cellar, he enjoyed watching the Nazis scurry like rats toward the government bomb shelters and train stations below street level, terrified they'd be blown to pieces. "Let's go." Tsura pointed to a Nazi car, black, shining, abandoned in the street. Bounding up the cellar steps, she called back to Marko. "The engine's on." Right behind her, Marko laughed. "Are you serious?" They jumped in. As Tsura drove them south, they heard an explosion in the distance. "Where are we going?" Marko asked. "Stop talking." Marko would never tell her, as it would only have gone to her head, but his sister made him proud. She was fearless and always had a clear goal. With the Gestapo's roundups of Berlin's Jews well underway, they'd spent the day in the wine cellar. Tsura had talked about Kizzy, anxious they'd never see their younger cousin again. She'd fantasized about going to Marzahn, shooting the encampment guards dead, and finding their mother and aunt. Within a few minutes, they were in the Bavarian Quarter. Tsura parked the stolen car in front of an upscale apartment building. "Get out," Tsura said. Marko followed Tsura into the building and up its iron staircase. A blast in the distance thundered through the stairwell. "Where are we? Is this where you live?" he asked. "Be quiet." Marko watched Tsura tap some kind of password on the door. The door was opened by a good-looking man, a little older than Marko, with a beard and dark hair. His white shirt was tucked into gray trousers that were held up by black cloth braces. His feet were bare. Marko and the young man exchanged guarded stares. "Shouldn't you be in a bomb shelter?" the man said to Tsura. Marko couldn't tell if he was kidding. "This is my brother," Tsura said. The man furrowed his eyebrows and Marko smirked. Tsura grabbed a heavy coat from the rack and threw it at the man. "Get dressed. We're going to Marzan. Right now." "Marzan?" Marko let out a laugh. "Sis, we're in the middle of an air raid." "Where's Seraph?" Tsura asked, ignoring her brother. "Basement," the man said, already putting on his socks. "See you in the car. 2 minutes," Tsura said to Marko, and she ran back into the hallway. "I'm Marko." He held out his hand. The man's handshake was strong. "Wolf." As Wolf tied his boots, Marko checked out the expensive furniture and oil paintings. "I didn't realize my sister lived with rich kids." Wolf half smiled and led Marko downstairs. There's no way Tsura would let him drive, but Marko tried his luck. As he climbed into the driver's seat of the stolen car, he heard the bombs approaching. Wolf sat in the back and rolled down the window. It felt as though Berlin was being liberated, but Marko's head swirled with fears for Alex wherever he was. His hands on the wheel, he checked his watch. Tsura appeared with a young woman by her side. The woman had an angular face and short hair, and she smiled at Marko warmly, and then she leaned through the back window, grabbed Wolf's face, and planted a kiss on his mouth. "This is my baby brother, Marko. This is Seraph," Tsura said. Marko ignored his sister's dig. Seraph nodded. "Good to meet you, Marko." "Same here." "Seraph's driving," Tsura snapped. Marko groaned and climbed into the back seat with Wolf. Tsura joined Seraph in the front. "What's your plan, sis?" Marko asked. Seraph slammed her foot down and the car took off, east in the direction of the blasts. Finally, Tsura seemed to relax. "The Marzan guards will be hiding from the bombs," Tsura explained. When a blast close by made Marko jump, Seraph laughed. "I'm not scared if I'm killed," she boasted. Wolf looked at Marko. "Good to know." "Stop chatting. Drive faster," Tsura said. "Don't worry, I'm more fun than my sister." They were close to the park with the fountain and the fairy tale statues, Mark realized. Broden lives near here. Every part of him needed to know what happened to Alex. Marko tapped Seraph's shoulder. "Turn right. Friedrichshain." "What? No, stay on this road," Tsura instructed Seraph. "We've got to look for Broden." "No, Marko, not now. Alex was arrested." "You don't know that. I'm serious. It'll take 2 minutes. Turn here or I'm jumping out." Seraph gave Tsura a stare. Tsura crossed her arms and looked away, and Seraph steered the wheel right. Wolf stayed quiet. Behind them, bombs crashed into buildings between the river and Heckescher Market. They continued on the road along the riverbank. "Turn left," Marko told Seraph. "Be quick," Tsura said. Marko rushed up to Alex's house and pounded on the front door. A loud whistling filled the air and a bomb landed streets away. The ground and houses around him shook, and the sky lit up bright with every blast. "Marko, we have to go!" Tsura screamed from the car. Seraph was shouting too. The blackout blinds on the windows had been pulled down. Ignoring his sister and Seraph, Marko found a rock and threw it through the window. The glass shattered and he used his boot to kick out an entry. They'd be in the basement. It was dark, but he could see around the furniture in the hallway. "Broden! Alex Broden!" he shouted down the steps into the darkness. "Ruti!" The basement was empty. Another bomb hit close, and Marko bolted upstairs into Alex's bedroom. He noticed Alex's map book on the floor. They'd looked through it on Friday night, side by side on his bed, planning their train journey to the border. Downstairs, he swung open the front door. Tsura was screaming, "Get in, you idiot!" Marko threw himself into the car. Seraph looked terrified. Wolf looked bored. "What's wrong with you?" Tsura shouted. An explosion lit up the night sky. There was a fire on the next street. Seraph took the car east toward Marzan. "What's that?" Wolf asked, looking at the map book in Marko's hands. "Nobody was home," Marko replied. "Broden's gone." Over the siren, an explosion lit up the buildings around them. Marko looked up at the sky. With jets overhead, he couldn't see the stars. He felt sick. Broden was arrested, he knew. Maybe his whole family. Every so often, Seraph looked at Wolf in the rearview mirror the way Alex always stared at Marko. He remembered Wolf was Jewish, like Alex. Wolf's yellow star was gone too. Marko gripped Alex's map book and made a plan in his head to search the city for Nazis, page by page, street by street. Me and my knife. Watching the warplanes, Tsura hit her fist on the dashboard. "I hope they burn Berlin to the ground." "It's retaliation for German bombs on London. The British want to destroy the Gestapo headquarters," Seraph guessed. All Marko wanted was for Alex, wherever he was, to survive the war. "I'll go to London and find him there." They drove for 15 minutes, heading northeast to the edge of the city. "We'll only have until sirens stop. Until then, the guards will be taking cover," Tsura explained. The siren stayed steady. Minutes later, when Seraph stopped the car on an empty road, the whirring engine was replaced by bombs falling in the distance. The bombs sounded like thunder, but quick, one after another. Tsura pointed into the night. "There's the camp." The area looked familiar. Marko remembered himself as a boy. He could recall the adjacent refuse dump and his mother putting out their clothes rinsed in dirty water on the washing line by their hut. Broth boiled on the fire. People fell ill. He remembered baby Samuel, Kizzy's brother, screaming. At the side of the road, Marko was startled when Seraph and Wolf pulled guns from their coats. Real pistols. Seraph showed off, aiming at planes in the sky, pretending to pull the trigger. Guns are for cowards, Marko said, but he was jealous. Then Marko pulled out his knife, which made Wolf laugh. Go play with the kids, Seraph said. Tsura let out a loud huff. Enough! Marko, Wolf, and Seraph smirked at one another, as if Tsura had reprimanded a group of kids. But when Tsura took out a pair of binoculars from her coat followed by a gun, she winked at him. Marko laughed. What the hell? Let's go, his sister said, no longer smiling. Kizzy. Every time a bomb crashed, the building rattled, and the children's cries grew louder, even the boys. One girl wouldn't stop staring at Kizzy. She wants me to comfort her. Kizzy crawled into the corner, covered her ears, and looked away. She told herself the air raid would stop soon. The bombs would kill the Nazi guards and they'd all run. I'll find Tsura and Marko. The loudest bomb yet made the children scream in unison. The room lit up. One little boy announced that the building down the street was on fire. Get away from the windows, Kizzy shouted. Kizzy had been in the same freezing building for 2.5 days now. She made a mental note of the date. The first day of March, Monday. When the sirens had started, the guards had left and locked the door. Right away, Kizzy had told the kids to stay away from the windows. She reminded them about the small air raid around 6 weeks ago. For days afterward, the streets were filled with glass. If a bomb hit close by, the glass would shatter. Over the siren, Felix crawled to where Kizzy and Esther sat. Felix was shaking. If we're not killed, the soldiers will come back. They'll punish us for the air raid and send us to Poland. It's where they murder Jews. My papa told me about it. Shh! You'll scare the little ones, Esther said, holding her 4-year-old cousin close. They're already scared, Felix replied. As more bombs crashed close by, Esther covered her ears. Felix's warning didn't apply to Kizzy. I'm not Jewish. They'll send me somewhere else. If a window breaks, we should jump out, Felix suggested. Esther disagreed. And run into falling bombs? Kizzy sided with Felix, but his idea was flawed. We still won't get through the wire, Kizzy said, pointing at the lattice of sharp and twisted barbs secured across the window frames. As the bombs fell, Kizzy could hear the adults whimpering in the room next door. When one of the children opened the cupboard in the room was filled with the stink of bathroom waste. There was no proper toilet, only a bucket in the cupboard. The smell was disgusting, and Kizzy had tried to stop herself from needing to use it. In 2 days, she'd used the bucket 3 times. Kizzy put her hand into her pinafore. She'd forgotten about Dur's cigarettes, the ones she'd taken. I could trade them for food. In her coat pockets, she found her bar of soap and Professor Dur's key. She held the soap to her nostrils and inhaled its flowery scent, blocking out the stench of the bucket. Kizzy wondered if Professor Dur was all right. I bet she's happy Berlin's getting bombed. The war would be over soon. Carefully, so the younger children couldn't see, she took out Marko's bar of chocolate from her pocket. She returned the key and soap to her coat. She nudged Esther's arm. Want some? Yes. Esther's eyes bulged. Felix almost screamed with delight. Shh. Kizzy put her finger to her lips. Kizzy opened the packet and broke the chocolate into sections, passing 2 pieces to Esther for her and little Ari, and 1 piece to Felix, keeping most for himself. As the bombs fell and the little children screamed and cried, Kizzy ate. The chocolate helped Ari to calm down, and he rested his head of fiery red hair in Esther's lap. Esther watched the other children as she took a bite. Esther seemed to feel bad for not sharing, but Kizzy and Felix didn't care. Felix ate his piece in one go, stuffing the chocolate in without looking at it. Kizzy swallowed the chocolate quickly, too. The bitter taste led to thoughts of Marko. The chocolate had been a gift from her cousin. Marko sent me to the hospital. He got me arrested. Now I'm breathing in this stink and stuck with these annoying kids. It made Kizzy smile that she was thinking of the toilet waste and Marko at the same time. I wish Marko was here right now. She smiled even more for thinking about her stupid cousin like that. More explosions. Kizzy wondered if Adolf Hitler could hear the bombs. Was he terrified of the explosions too? As some younger children called out to their parents through tears, Esther patted Ari's red hair. His eyes closed and opened, fighting sleep. Oh God! Esther shrieked. Felix jumped. What is it? Esther pushed Ari away and jumped to her feet. Lice! He's got lice! Ari began to cry, and Kizzy crawled toward him. Esther, will you get away from the window? Esther crouched away from them while Kizzy leaned over Ari, and with her fingers pulling through his red hair examined his scalp. There's nothing here. Esther edged closer and pointed to the floor. What's that? Kizzy picked up what at first looked like a tiny speck of dirt. "It's a flea," Esther screamed. "It's dead," Kizzy said. Esther was more terrified of the dead flea than the falling bombs. In her head, Kizzy laughed. Locked in the building with the Jewish children made her feel safer. If they were hit, she'd be killed with them. Not in Marzahn. Her life would end in the middle of Berlin, with the taste of chocolate between her teeth and along her gums. Kizzy felt content to be alone. She hoped Tsura and Marko were safe while Berlin burned.